The men in the walls. Emily had always dreamed of living alone. After years of sharing spaces with roommates, she finally saved up enough to rent her first apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it had character. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and tall vintage windows that let in just the right amount of sunlight. Despite its age, Emily felt drawn to the place. It felt like it had a story, and she was ready to add her own chapter to it. Her new home was on the third floor of a brick building that had probably been around for at least a century. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and something she couldn't quite place. Her neighbor, Mr. Duncan, lived right across the hall. He was a quiet man in his late 50s, always dressed in plain clothes, and when she told him about Harry, she would always tell her to take steps cautious and never to run away. The first time they met, he greeted her with a polite smile and a few words of welcome, but there was something about the way he lingered in the doorway that made her a little uneasy. She told herself she was just being paranoid. He seemed harmless enough. The first week in her new apartment was exciting. Emily spent her days decorating, arranging furniture, and getting used to living alone. At night, she curled up on her couch with a book or a movie, enjoying the peace and quiet. But then, things started to change. It began with small noises. At first, she thought it was just the building settling. Old buildings made noises, she reminded herself. The soft creaks and groans were normal. But soon the sounds became harder to ignore. Late at night, when everything was silent, she'd hear faint tapping coming from the walls. It wasn't constant, just an occasional sound that seemed to come from different parts of her apartment. Sometimes it was behind her bed, other times near the kitchen. She tried to brush it off as pipes or maybe even a mouse, but deep down, it unsettled her. One night, the tapping grew louder. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was scratching. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing. She told herself it was just her imagination, but when she pressed her ear to the wall, she froze. She could hear faint breathing. It was slow and steady, as if someone was just on the other side. How long have they been gone for? Emily wanted to know. Did they come in to take the keys, or were they scared? Emily lay on her bed, staring at the wall, all over with panic. Maybe someone was just on the other side. Terrified, she jumped out of bed and turned on all the lights in her apartment. She grabbed her phone and called her landlord the next morning. When she told him about the noises, he laughed it off. "It's an old building," he said. "Probably just rodents in the walls. Nothing to worry about." Emily wasn't convinced. She decided to call an exterminator. When he arrived, he did a thorough inspection of the apartment, checking every corner and crevice. After a while, he shook his head. "There's no sign of pests," he said. "No droppings, no damage, nothing. It's strange. I can't find anything living in these walls," she said. That night, Emily felt more uneasy than ever. She double-checked that all her doors and windows were locked before going to bed. But the noises didn't stop. The scratching came back, louder than before, and now it was accompanied by soft thuds, as if something was moving behind the walls. She couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, clutching her blanket, her mind racing with possibilities. The next day, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a small camera, the kind people use for home security, and set it up in her living room. She positioned it to face the wall where the noises were loudest. If something was going on, she wanted proof. The following morning, Emily hesitated before checking the footage. Part of her didn't want to know what the camera had captured, but curiosity and fear pushed her to hit play. As she watched the video, her stomach tightened. For most of the night, everything looked normal. The camera recorded hours of an empty, silent living room. But then, around 3 a.m., something happened. The camera looked about ready to flash an electrical light. Then a report on a piece of electronics read the name of the CD show on the screen. In the footage, a section of the wall seemed to move. A hidden panel slid open, and a man stepped out. Emily's blood ran cold as she recognized him. It was Mr. Duncan, her neighbor. He moved quietly, almost like he knew exactly where everything was. He walked around her apartment, opening drawers, looking through her belongings, and even standing over her bed for a few moments. Then, just as silently, he slipped back into the wall, closing the panel behind him. Emily's hands shook as she paused the video. She felt sick. How long had this been happening? How many nights had he been in her apartment without her knowing? She didn't waste any time. She called the police and showed them the footage. When they arrived, they searched her apartment and found the hidden passage. It connected her apartment to Mr. Duncan's. He had been using it to spy on her and enter her home whenever he wanted. 15 minutes later, her apartment resembled a shaft from Duncan's contraption. They climbed into her apartment and found the hidden passage. She had been using it to spy on her and enter her home whenever he wanted. Mr. Duncan was arrested, but Emily couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep in her chest. She moved out the very next day, leaving behind the apartment she had once been so excited about. Living alone no longer felt like a dream. It felt like a nightmare she never wanted to relive. But as she sat in the kitchen looking for a meal plan, her phone rang and it was Joe's sisters. Night before last when she was flying with the watching window. When Sarah and her husband Mike bought their first home in a quiet suburb, they thought they had found the perfect place to start their new life. It was a cozy 2-story house with a big kitchen, a charming front porch, and a small sunny garden in the backyard. The neighborhood was peaceful, with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs or watered their lawns. Everything seemed idyllic. Their closest neighbor, Mrs. Harper, lived in the house next door. She was an older woman, likely in her 70s, with silver hair that she wore in a neat bun. She appeared friendly, always sitting on her porch with a book or a cup of tea. On their first day, as Sarah and Mike carried boxes into the house, Mrs. Harper waved at them warmly. Sarah thought she seemed sweet and unassuming, the perfect neighbor to have in a quiet area like this. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Sarah spent her days unpacking and arranging their home while Mike went to work at his new job. Sarah loved the big kitchen, which had a wide window above the sink that overlooked Mrs. Harper's house. She often saw Mrs. Harper tending to her garden or sitting by the window, knitting or reading. It gave Sarah a sense of comfort, knowing someone else was nearby while she adjusted to the new house. But then, Sarah started noticing something odd. Every time she looked out her kitchen window, Mrs. Harper seemed to be staring directly at their house. At first, Sarah thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe Mrs. Harper liked sitting by her window, and her gaze happened to fall in Sarah's direction. But the more it happened, the more unsettling it became. No matter the time of day, morning, afternoon, or evening, Mrs. Harper was there, her eyes fixed on the kitchen window. She never waved or smiled like she had before. She just stared. Sarah tried to shrug it off, telling herself it wasn't a big deal. "She's probably just lonely," Mike said when Sarah mentioned it to him. "Maybe she doesn't have much else to do." But the staring didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. Some nights, Sarah would walk into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and glance out the window, only to see Mrs. Harper's silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a lamp. Her unblinking eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. Sarah started avoiding the kitchen window altogether. She closed the curtains during the day and kept them shut at night, but even then, she could feel Mrs. Harper's presence. It was as if the older woman's gaze could penetrate through the walls. Sarah's unease grew with each passing day. One evening, after Mike had gone to bed, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to confront Mrs. Harper and put an end to this bizarre behavior. Gathering her courage, she walked over to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. There was no response. She knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. The porch light was off and the curtains were drawn. It didn't seem like anyone was home. The next day, Sarah tried again. She rang the doorbell and knocked several times, but still no answer. Frustrated and curious, she decided to take a closer look. She walked around the side of the house, peering through the windows. The curtains were drawn tightly in most rooms, but as she approached the living room window, she saw something that made her heart race. There, standing by the window, was the figure she had been seeing all along. It was dressed in one of Mrs. Harper's floral dresses and had the same silvery hair pulled into a bun. But something was off. The figure didn't move. It didn't react to Sarah's presence. As Sarah looked closer, she realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't Mrs. Harper at all. It was a mannequin. Sarah stumbled backward, her mind racing. Why would someone put a mannequin by the window dressed like Mrs. Harper? What was going on? She ran back to her house and locked the doors, her hands trembling. When Mike came home, she told him what she had seen. At first he laughed, thinking it was some kind of prank, or that Sarah's imagination was getting the better of her. But when he saw how shaken she was, his expression grew serious. "Sarah," he said to her, as he came and sat down next to her, "what have you seen?" "We should call the police," Mike said. "If something's wrong, they can figure it out." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. That evening, they reported the situation to the local authorities. 2 officers arrived shortly after and went to investigate Mrs. Harper's house. Sarah and Mike watched from their porch as the officers knocked on the door and, when no one answered, entered the house. What they found inside was far worse than Sarah could have imagined. The real Mrs. Harper was lying in her bedroom, lifeless. The coroner later determined she had been dead for weeks. The mannequin had been placed at the window deliberately, positioned to look like Mrs. Harper was still alive and watching. But the biggest question remained: who had put the mannequin there, and why? The police conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing neighbors and searching the house for clues, but no answers came. There were no signs of forced entry, and no one in the neighborhood had seen anything unusual. The case remained a mystery. The experience left Sarah deeply unsettled. She and Mike decided to move away from the house, unable to shake the eerie memories. Even in their new home, Sarah couldn't escape the haunting image of the mannequin standing at the window, its lifeless eyes staring into the night. As time passed, Sarah often wondered about Mrs. Harper and the strange events surrounding her death. Who had gone to such lengths to create the illusion that she was still alive? Was it someone trying to cover up a crime, or was it something even more sinister? The questions lingered, unanswered, like shadows in the corners of her mind. Years later, Sarah still found herself drawn to the mystery of Mrs. Harper's house. She occasionally searched online for any updates or new information about the case, but nothing ever came up. It remained an unsolved puzzle, a chilling reminder of the strange and unexplainable things that can happen behind closed doors. The Basement Visitor. Mark was an aspiring writer who needed a quiet place to focus. He decided to rent a small house in a peaceful town far from the noise of the city. The rent was affordable, which was a big plus for Mark, and the house had a spacious basement. Mark didn't think much about the basement at first, except that it would be a good place to store some boxes and old furniture. He was excited to finally have a place where he could write in peace. Sometime later, he married his current wife and had a large family who had a farmhouse, and he was proud to have a place where he could write in peace. Mark's new neighborhood was calm and quiet, just as he had hoped. His closest neighbor, Joe, lived 2 houses away. Joe was a friendly man, always eager to chat when they bumped into each other. However, Mark soon noticed that Joe was a bit nosy. Joe asked a lot of questions about Mark's life, where he was from, why he moved to the town, and what he was working on. At first, Mark didn't mind answering, but over time, he found Joe's curiosity a little strange. Still, he didn't think much of it. Joe seemed harmless enough. Mark settled into his new home and started writing. His days were simple. He wrote in the mornings, took walks in the afternoons, and read books in the evenings. Life in the quiet town was just what he needed, but everything changed one night. A week after his father disappeared into the woods in California, the phone rang in his pocket. He picked it up. It was late and Mark was fast asleep when he woke up to a strange sound. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but then he heard it again. It was coming from the basement. The noise sounded like faint footsteps, as if someone was slowly walking around down there. Mark's heart raced. Who could be in his basement? There was a long moment of silence, and then a man's voice. He said, "Who could be in his basement?" Mark grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way downstairs. His hands were shaking as he opened the basement door. He pointed the flashlight around the dark, cluttered space, but everything looked normal. The boxes and furniture were exactly where he had left them. There was no one there. Mark tried to convince himself that he was just imagining things. Maybe the house was old and the noises were just creaks and groans from the wood. The surface torn by marks and markings. The tattered carpet and rusty glass were missing the walls, and the noises were just creaks and groans from the wood. Feeling uneasy but tired, he went back to bed. The next morning, Mark brushed off the experience. He told himself that it had just been his imagination. But the noises didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Mark heard them again and again. Sometimes it was the sound of footsteps, other times faint whispers that he couldn't quite make out. Each time he would check the basement, but it was always empty. Then one day this happened. The basement was like an electrical plague with wires crawling all over the basement. Mark started to feel paranoid. He began locking the basement door at night, hoping that would put his mind at ease. But the noises continued, and they seemed to be getting louder. It was as if whoever or whatever was in the basement wanted to make sure Mark heard them. One evening, Mark decided to spend some time organizing the basement. He thought it might help him figure out what was going on. As he moved boxes and cleaned, he noticed something strange behind one of the shelves. It was a small camera, carefully hidden and pointed directly at the area where Mark often sat to write. Mark's stomach dropped. Someone had been watching him. One evening, Mark immediately called the police. He explained what he had found and how he had been hearing noises for weeks. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. To Mark's horror, they found more cameras hidden in different rooms. Each camera was connected to a single feed. The police traced the feed back to Joe's house. Joe had been spying on Mark since the day he moved in. He had installed the cameras in the house before Mark rented it. Joe's curiosity wasn't harmless after all. He had been watching Mark's every move, listening to him, and even recording him. The police arrested Joe, and Mark was left shaken. He couldn't believe that someone he had considered a friendly neighbor had betrayed him in such a terrifying way. Even though Joe was gone, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The experience left him so uneasy that he decided to move out. He found a new place to live and promised himself that he would never rent a house with a basement again. End of poem. Mark's life before the incident. Before moving to the quiet town, Mark had lived in a bustling city. The constant noise and distractions had made it hard for him to focus on his writing. He dreamed of finishing his novel, but he needed a calm environment to make it happen. That's why the small house with the basement seemed perfect. It was away from the city, affordable, and gave him the solitude he craved. Mark's daily routine in the new house was simple but productive. He would wake up early, make himself a cup of coffee, and sit by the window to write. The peaceful surroundings inspired him, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was making real progress on his novel. In the afternoons, he took long walks through the town, enjoying the quiet streets and friendly faces. Life seemed perfect, and Mark was happy. Joe's behavior. Joe was always around. At first, Mark thought it was nice to have a neighbor who was so welcoming. Joe would wave every time he saw Mark and often stop by to chat. But as time went on, Mark noticed that Joe's questions were a little too personal. Joe wanted to know everything about Mark's life, where he had lived before, why he moved to the town, and even what he was writing about. Mark started to feel uncomfortable, but didn't want to be rude, so he tried to keep the conversations short. One day, Joe offered to help Mark if he ever needed anything. "I'm just down the street," Joe said with a friendly smile. "If you need help with the house or anything else, just let me know." Mark thanked him, but didn't think much of it. He wanted to focus on his writing, not get too involved with his neighbor, who was a Renaissance man. The growing fear. As the noises in the basement continued, Mark's fear grew. He started sleeping with a flashlight next to his bed, and even considered buying a lock for his bedroom door. Every creak of the house made him jump. He couldn't focus on his writing anymore. The peaceful home he had once loved now felt like a trap. He wasn't the biggest fan of the latest Eternal Sunshine and Flowers movies or TV shows, but in the chaos of the last few months, the possibilities of this interesting tale had never been more enticing. As it happened, Mark tried to tell himself that the noises were just in his head. Maybe he was overthinking things, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The discovery of the hidden camera confirmed his worst fears. Someone had been watching him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The aftermath. After Joe's arrest, Mark's life was never the same. He moved to a new town and found a small apartment without a basement. He couldn't bring himself to live in a house again, especially one with hidden spaces. The experience left him feeling paranoid and constantly looking over his shoulder. He started checking every room of his new home for cameras, even though he knew it was unlikely to happen again. The same thing was true when living with his first wife. When it came time to leave the basement to move on to the next house, the basement room was at the back of the house again. Mark's writing suffered as well. The fear and anxiety made it hard for him to concentrate. He had hoped that moving to a quiet town would help him finish his novel, but instead, it turned into a nightmare. Over time, Mark began to heal, but the memory of Joe's betrayal stayed with him. It was a lesson he would never forget. It was a lesson a culture would easily forget, if this was an example. Mark slowly made his way back to Joe's. The fear and anxiety made it hard for him to concentrate. It was the small house in the quiet town had seemed like a dream come true, but it turned into a nightmare for Mark. What started as a peaceful retreat ended with fear, betrayal, and lasting scars. Mark's story is a reminder to trust your instincts and to be cautious, even in places that seem safe. He moved on with his life, but the experience changed him forever. The silent tenant. Claire and her boyfriend Ben had been searching for the perfect apartment for months. Living in the city was expensive, and finding a place that fit their budget, had enough space, and wasn't falling apart was no easy task. After weeks of looking at tiny, overpriced apartments and run-down buildings, they finally found a place that seemed perfect. A couple of weeks later, they found themselves living in Texas on a lot at the bottom of a lot of roads in the middle of nowhere. Claire had a harder time finding a place that wasn't falling apart with the living situation, but when they finally found the place that fit their needs, they finally found a place that seemed perfect. The apartment was located in a quiet neighborhood on a tree-lined street. It was an older building, but it had character. The brick exterior was charming, and the inside had high ceilings and large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. Best of all, it was affordable. Claire and Ben couldn't believe their luck when the landlord called to tell them their application had been approved. On moving day, the landlord, Mr. Harris, met them at the building to hand over the keys and go over a few rules. He was an older man with a friendly smile and a calm demeanor. As he walked them through the apartment, he mentioned something that caught Claire's attention. The girls followed him around the apartment and scanned the ceilings for evidence of crime. "A unit above you is empty," he said, gesturing toward the ceiling. "It's been vacant for a while now, so you shouldn't have to worry about noise from upstairs neighbors." And Bailey's heart rate skyrocketed as his hands rose to protect her body. His fingertips were warm over hers, so he shouldn't have to worry about noise from upstairs neighbors. Claire smiled. "That's a relief," she said. She had always been sensitive to noise, and the thought of not having to deal with stomping feet or late-night parties above her head was a major bonus. Ben, on the other hand, was more focused on getting their furniture inside. "Sounds good," he said absent-mindedly as he carried a box into the living room. He stood in front of the family, looking each of them in the eyes. As he held open the door, something caught in his throat. Over the next few days, Claire and Ben worked on making the apartment feel like home. They hung up their favorite artwork, arranged their furniture, and unpacked their belongings. By the end of the week, the apartment was cozy and welcoming. Claire felt happy and content in their new space. But the peace didn't last long. One evening, as they were settling in to watch a movie, Claire heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps. She paused the movie and looked at Ben. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Ben shrugged. "Probably just the building settling," he said, brushing it off. Claire wasn't convinced. The sound had been clear. Definitely footsteps. But she didn't want to overreact, so she let it go. Over Over the next few days, the noises continued. Sometimes it was footsteps, other times it sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Once, Claire even thought she heard faint laughter. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the unit above them. Sometimes that laughter would sound like laughter in the hallway upstairs. When that happened, Claire would pray to be alone. Finally, Claire decided to bring it up with the landlord. She called Mr. Harris and explained what she'd been hearing. "That's strange," he said. "The unit is definitely empty. No one has lived there in years." "Are you sure?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Because it really sounds like someone is up there, and some of them are very old." The girls closest to the windows heard it first. It sounded like Claire was right, and the men were summoned. "Positive," Mr. Harris replied. "I have the only key to that unit, and I haven't been up there in months." Claire hung up the phone, feeling uneasy. If the landlord was telling the truth, then where were the noises coming from? That evening, Claire told Ben what Mr. Harris had said. Ben, who had always been the more skeptical of the two, tried to reassure her. "It's probably just the pipes or something," he said. "Old buildings make weird noises." But Claire couldn't shake her unease. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, she convinced Ben to help her investigate. They decided to wait until the noises started again before making their move. "The scariest part," Ben said. 2 nights later, as they were getting ready for bed, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed from above. Claire grabbed a flashlight, and Ben grabbed his phone. They crept out of their apartment and up the stairs to the second-floor unit. The door to the apartment was slightly ajar. Claire and Ben exchanged nervous glances. "Didn't the landlord say he had the only key?" Claire whispered. Ben nodded. "Maybe he forgot to lock it last time he was here," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and cold. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. Claire shone her flashlight around the room. It was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing to suggest that anyone had been living there. It felt as they turned to leave, a loud crash echoed through the apartment. They spun around, their hearts pounding. In the beam of the flashlight, they saw a chair lying on its side in the middle of the room. Claire's hands began to shake. "That wasn't there before," she said. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, grabbing her arm. They ran back to their apartment and locked the door behind them. Claire called the police, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived. Claire and Ben explained what had happened and led the officers upstairs. The officers searched the unit thoroughly, but found no evidence of anyone being there. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to explain the noises or the visitor. Unable to think of all the possible scenarios, the officers got back in their chair. "Old buildings can be creepy," one of the officers said, trying to reassure them. "But there's no one up here. You're safe." Claire didn't feel safe. Neither did Ben. The strange noises continued over the next few weeks, and the atmosphere in their apartment grew tense. Claire started having trouble sleeping, and Ben became irritable. They argued more and more, and the once cozy apartment began to feel like a prison. Finally, they decided they couldn't stay there any longer. They broke their lease and moved out, leaving behind the apartment and its mysterious upstairs unit. The story goes that after the band moved out, the landlord actually passed out in the bathroom and had to be co-opted. Months later, Claire was talking to a friend who knew the neighborhood well. When she mentioned the building they had lived in, her friend's expression changed. "Didn't you know?" her friend asked. "A man died in that building years ago. He lived in the unit above yours. Some people say it's haunted." Claire's stomach dropped. She wanted to dismiss it as a coincidence, but she couldn't ignore the chills that ran down her spine. To this day, she's not sure what she experienced in that apartment. Was it a ghost, or was it just her imagination? She prefers not to think about it too much, but every now and then the memories come back, and she wonders if the silent tenant still lingers above. The backyard stranger. Lila had always loved her small, cozy house, surrounded by the peaceful woods. It was a dream come true for her, a quiet escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house was nestled at the end of a long, winding road, with no other homes in sight except for her neighbor Alan's place, a mile away. Alan was a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. Though he was polite and friendly during their rare interactions, he didn't socialize much. That was fine by Lila, who appreciated the solitude. Lila spent her days working from home as a graphic designer, and her evenings relaxing on her porch. The porch quickly became her favorite spot. She loved sitting there, surrounded by the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was her little slice of heaven. One evening, after finishing her work, Lila brewed a cup of tea and grabbed her favorite book. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the trees. She settled into her porch chair, enjoying the cool evening breeze. As she flipped through the pages of her book, she felt a sense of contentment that she hadn't experienced in years. Everything felt perfect. But that night, something unusual happened. While Lila was reading, she caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the woods. At first, she thought it was Alan. Perhaps he had decided to take a walk and ended up near her property. She called out, "Alan, is that you?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She waved her hand to get their attention, but the person didn't react. Feeling uneasy, she decided to go inside. She locked all the doors and windows, something she rarely did in such a safe and secluded area. The next morning, Lila convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe her eyes had played tricks on her in the fading light. She went about her day as usual, trying not to dwell on the strange encounter. That evening, she returned to her porch, determined to enjoy her time outside. She brought her tea and book again, hoping for a peaceful night. But as the sun set and the woods grew darker, she saw the figure again. This time it was in the same spot as before, standing just at the edge of the trees. Lila's heart raced. It was too far away to make out any details, but she could tell it was a person. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, hoping it would move or reveal itself. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. No one spoke. That was when she realized that she might have something in common with the figure she was seeing now. Lila felt her anxiety rising. She went back inside and closed the curtains, trying to push the image out of her mind. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside her window made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching her. Over the next few weeks, the figure appeared several more times. It always stood in the same spot, never coming closer, but never leaving either. Lila became increasingly paranoid. She started double-checking all the locks before going to bed and kept her phone by her side at all times. She even stopped sitting on her porch in the evenings, something that had once brought her so much joy. When she was 9, she finally told her mother, "It was time to retire from the job rather than take a risk of getting up and closer to my family." And once she was up and closer to the ceiling, something that had once brought her so much joy, one day she decided she couldn't handle it anymore and called the police. When the officers arrived, she explained the situation, describing the figure she had seen. They walked through the woods, searching the area where the person had been standing, but they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The police assured her it was probably just a trespasser or someone passing through, but Lila wasn't convinced. Somehow she knew it was real. She knew what she had seen, and it didn't feel like a random encounter. Determined to protect herself, Lila bought a security camera and installed it on her porch. She hoped it would capture any evidence of the figure if it showed up again. She also started carrying a flashlight and a small can of pepper spray whenever she went outside. Though she tried to go about her daily life, the sense of peace she once felt in her home was gone. One evening, Lila decided she had had enough. She was tired of living in fear and wanted answers. Armed with her flashlight, she ventured out to the edge of the woods where she had seen the figure. The air was cool, and the trees cast long, eerie shadows under the moonlight. As she approached the spot, her heart pounded in her chest. The figure wasn't there, but something else was. Lila found a small campsite hidden among the trees. There was a sleeping bag, a pile of food wrappers, and an old backpack. Her stomach turned when she saw what else was there. A collection of photos. They were pictures of her, taken from outside her house. Some showed her sitting on the porch, while others were taken through her windows. Lila felt a wave of terror wash over her. Someone had been watching her, and for a long time. She didn't waste a second. She ran back to her house, locked the doors, and called the police. This time, they took her report seriously. Officers searched the woods thoroughly, but the campsite was empty by the time they arrived. Whoever had been there was long gone. The discovery shook Lila to her core. She couldn't stop thinking about the photos and how close the stranger had been to her home. She installed more security cameras around her property and even considered getting a dog for added protection. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, the stress became too much. Lila decided to sell her house and move closer to town. She found a small apartment with neighbors nearby, hoping the change would help her feel safe again. Though she loved her old home, she couldn't live with the memories of what had happened there. To this day, Lila wonders who the stranger was and why they had been watching her. She often thinks about the campsite and the photos, trying to piece together a story that makes sense, but she knows she may never have the answers. All she can do is move forward, carrying the lessons of caution and awareness with her. Lila's experience serves as a reminder that even the safest places can hold hidden dangers. Though she lost her sense of peace, she gained a new appreciation for her own resilience. And while the mystery of the backyard stranger remains unsolved, Lila knows she did everything she could to protect herself and reclaim her life.